I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Tonight I've got Peter Dickinson, who is the Ukraine editor for the Atlantic Alert, Atlantic Council. Peter is in Kyiv, and he's written a couple of very provocative articles in the last little while. One that is about that Putin doesn't want peace at all, and another one that he wants he wants Ukraine without Ukrainians. Peter Dickinson, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to join you.
My pleasure having you back again. So Putin wants Ukraine without Ukrainians. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. I mean, probably you could even go further. He wants Ukraine to be Russia without Ukrainians, or he doesn't want it to be Ukraine at all. But the point being that, what he's doing in Ukraine is not a matter of adjusting borders or expanding his area of control or influence or pushing NATO back or any of the other things that we hear about. He's actually literally trying to turn this country into Russia. So, and this is not speculation. We see this happening day to day in the area that is under Russian control. So around 20% of Ukraine is currently occupied by Russia. And we know it's well documented that in that area, all traces of Ukrainian culture, heritage, language, national identity are being systematically dismantled, removed, suppressed, and replaced by their Russian alternatives. So they're essentially being told, people are being told there, you can be Russian or nothing, and anyone who opposes this is dealt with very harshly. Thousands have disappeared into prisons. We don't know where they are, maybe tens of thousands. Many more have been deported. And those who refuse to take Russian passports, beginning in September, there's a new law that was passed in the spring of this year. So beginning in September of this year, the Russian authorities reserve the right to basically take anybody who's living in occupied Ukraine who has not got a Russian passport and basically kick them out of, expel them from their own homes and deport them to Ukraine. So, people who've lived in the same, for example, someone who's lived in the same village or town all their lives in their own home now could have some Russian soldiers march into their house and basically throw them out because they refuse to become Russians. So this is happening as we speak, literally day to day in Europe. This is not a theory, or this is not speculation that it might happen. It's happening now.
And you talk about how Ukrainian children in schools aren't allowed to speak Ukrainian anymore.
Yeah, they've outlawed that now. Well, I mean, and again, from beginning in September, they've officially ruled out any form of education in Ukrainian, even studying it as a foreign language, very minimally. In effect, that's been the case for some time, but they've basically made it official now. And so, there's now no longer even any sort of fig leaf that there's some, there was a period where they said, if you wish, you could have some minimal study in Ukrainian. Of course, most people wouldn't do that because they understood that they might make themselves targets. But now they're effectively saying, okay, you can't even have that now. We're banning it. This is Russia. There is there's no place here for anything Ukrainian. So no history, no language, no culture, no heritage, nothing.
You also say in your article that they're moving people from other parts of Russia into occupied Ukraine.
Yes. There've been various programs to bring people in. So they're trying to bring in people in different professional classes. So teachers, doctors, people like that. They're bringing them in from the the poorer parts of Russia. Because Russia is such a huge country with an enormous diversity of living standards. There are parts of Russia, particularly the very big cities, the major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the living standards are quite high. The salaries are quite high, living standards are comparable with many European countries. And there are parts of Russia going far, out into towards Siberia and far into the provinces where the standard of living, plummets down, and people they literally don't have indoor plumbing. They don't have access to running water. They don't have, they're not on the gas mains or anything like that. So they're living almost like sort of 19th century standards in some cases. So they're bringing people from these regions. They're trying to entice them to come to Ukraine, where again, there's a diversity, but the standard of living in general is higher, and the climate is more favourable, especially in the south, where they hold, where they're occupied parts of Ukraine. The climate is quite good. The agriculture is very good, and they're bringing people in there to live, in large numbers, as well as those in the professions. You've also got just people being offered to come and live there. Former soldiers as well, for example, they're being offered land. So people are being enticed to come and fight there, to be given land there, sort of settler colonialism, which is, a very old school format of colonialism that people would be doing in the 17th, 18th centuries or something. People going out to the Americas or something, or Africa or Asia. Russia's doing that now in Ukraine as well. So they're trying to erase all Ukrainian identity in the regions they control, and they're trying to change the demographic makeup there by pushing out people who are particularly, stronger, firm Ukrainian patriots who reject this Russification, and they're bringing in actual Russians so that they hope to establish, consolidate their control and make it an irreversible process, essentially.
Put it in perspective, if you could, for our listeners. People hear 20% of Ukraine. Ukraine's the largest country in Europe. Is this farmland? Is this industrial heartland? Has it got natural resources? Were there many people living there prior to its occupation by Russia? Put it in perspective for us, if you could.
Okay, so it's a big area. We're talking about an area, and 20% of Ukraine is the size of many it's the size of many European countries. I think it's probably, I don't know, maybe similar to the size of, Belgium and Holland together or something, or, a mid-sized American state, perhaps. It's a sizable territory. In terms of population, you're probably talking about a pre-war population in total of around, I think, probably about 8 million, perhaps 8 million people. Now, of course, that's gone down a lot now because of the amount of people who fled, because of the amount of people who've been deported, and so on. There's huge devastation there. A lot of the areas in this occupied regions have been destroyed. Whole towns in many cases. In terms of the geography of the regions, it's quite diverse. It's a broad space. You have very industrial regions to the east, on the border with Russia, the Donbass, which is where the war began in 2014. That's a very heavily industrialized region. Also has a lot of the resources. We have the minerals deal between Trump and the Ukrainians signed a few months ago. A lot of the minerals, the rare earth there, and the other very valuable mineral resources, they're actually in occupied Ukraine. They're under Russian control, and they're in the east of the country. The south, which also, there's 4 regions Russia now partially holds and claims. There's 2 in the east and 2 in the south. They're connected. It's a continuous block. The southern regions are much more agriculturally wealthy. It's essentially steppe land. It's the steppe leading from Crimea up into sort of European Ukraine, and that is very, 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 very fertile land with an enormous amount of agriculture going on there. So that's basically the breadbasket of Europe, as it was known for centuries. And so you put them together, it's a very wealthy area for Russia to hold. The agricultural wealth is huge, the mineral wealth is huge. And so, it has a lot of value for them. But for the Russians, of course, it's a stepping stone toward the overall conquest of Ukraine.
You also wrote fairly harshly that you think Putin just doesn't want peace. And let me quote, Trump offered a deal, leave behind the occupied territories, prohibit Ukraine from joining NATO, lift sanctions. He even considered recognizing the annexation of Crimea. Putin has said no. Putin doesn't want to make a deal. He wants to destroy. Russians forcibly distribute passports, build camps, destroy Ukrainian language and culture. For Putin, if Ukraine survives, Russia loses. He's playing for total destruction. Even Trump's surrender to Crimea didn't stop him. We're going to take a break. And when I come back, I'm going to ask Peter Dickinson, does Putin want peace or does he want utter destruction of Ukraine? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got Peter Dickinson with us tonight from Kyiv, Ukraine. He is the editor for the Ukraine Alert at the Atlantic Council, and he's written really quite a hard-hitting review recently that says that Putin doesn't want peace at all. He wants utter destruction of Ukraine. Why do you believe that, Peter?
Well, I mean, we've got to dig in here and find, think about what Putin is really all about here. What is he looking to achieve? Why has he launched this war? I mean, this war has transformed Russia. It's transformed Ukraine in terrible ways through the destruction of so much of the country. But it's transformed Russia. It's transformed Russia's relationship with the West, Russia's place in the world. So it's a huge gamble by Putin. It's really defining his reign. So why is he doing this? What is it that drives him? And I think if we want to understand this, we've got to sort of try and get inside Putin's head and get inside the head of his generation of Russians. Now, they are people who came of age in the 1980s and 1990s, the time when the Soviet Union imploded, essentially collapsed. And Putin, at the time of the Soviet, when Soviet Union began to unravel, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Putin was there. I mean, he was in Germany. He was a KGB officer in Dresden, in Germany, in East Germany. So he had basically a ringside seat, a sort of front row seat to watch this process of Russia's empire, as it were, then begin to just sort of fall apart, come apart at the seams against this wave of people power protests, pro-democracy movements, independence movements in these countries throughout Central and Eastern Europe. So he saw all that. He saw it happen he saw the Berlin Wall come down. He saw the Germans do it. He saw the Poles do it, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Bulgarians. Basically, the whole of Russia's Central European empire collapsed. And then Putin came back to Russia itself, and he watched the Soviet Union collapse. He watched the process continue into Russia. And then you had the 1991 complete breakup of the Soviet Union itself. So within the space of just a couple of years, the Soviet Union went from being a superpower, the superpower, along with America in the whole world, to becoming, by 1992, 1993, Russia was almost a third world country. I mean, the poverty was desperate. People were living in terrible conditions. The country had seen its status plummet. So this is what he lived through, and this is what he experienced as a relatively young man. I think he was in his 30s at the time. He was, his whole life was thrown into chaos, and this was the case for that whole generation of Russians. And I think a lot of people in the West don't really understand this. They don't really understand how devastating for Russia this was. We tend to think of the fall of the Soviet Union as a good thing, as a liberation, as something that people who lived there would have been happy about, because they weren't free. They were living in essentially a large, prison camp. Essentially, they weren't allowed to leave the Soviet Union. We all know about the dissidents trying to flee the Soviet Union. So I think there's a perception in the West that the fall of the Soviet Union was a good thing to celebrate, but it wasn't a good thing for the Russians. The Russians, for them, it was an absolutely disastrous defeat, and they lost. They lost approximately, probably territorially, around 30-40% of their empire, and population-wise, they lost more than half their empire, I believe. So they suffered a massive defeat almost overnight, and it all happened because the people rose up and said, "We don't want to be with you anymore, Russia. We want to get away. We want to break away from you. We want to live as democrats. We want to live in a free country. We want to be like the European model of civilization," essentially. So they basically rejected Russia. So that's the founding moment of Putin's political worldview. And now he takes power, and he's looking at this thinking, we've lost so much, we've got to try and get it back. And the one symbol of this humiliation, this defeat, this loss, the biggest symbol of all is Ukraine, because Ukraine is the heart of Russia's self-image. Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine, is considered by Russians to be the mother city of Russia. It's where Russian civilization comes from. It's where all Russia's national myths come from. Kiev is absolutely central to Russia's sense of national identity. And Ukraine, by extension, also is. So Ukraine is a lot more Russian to the average Russian than Siberia is, for example, or Chechnya, or Ingushetia, or Tatarstan, or other regions that are actually inside Russia today. Ukraine is almost as Russian to the Russians as Moscow or St. Petersburg. I mean, it's literally that deeply entwined in their national myth. So for Putin, reversing the fall of 1991 and getting Russia back to its rightful place in the world was always all about getting Ukraine, taking over Ukraine. So he always had this idea. He always had this idea in his head. He's got to get Ukraine back. Ukraine being outside of Russia is a big mistake. It's an injustice. He has to get it back. Now that was always there. Then, to add to this obsession of Putin's, was then Ukraine began saying, we want to be democratic. We want to be a European country. So in 2004, Putin tried to impose a pro-Russian president on Ukraine in the presidential election of 2004. The Ukrainian population rose up against that and held a revolution which came to be known as the Orange Revolution. So that was 20 years ago now. And it was a watershed moment for Ukraine. It was a moment where they rallied as a nation. Millions of people were on the streets. It was an incredible experience. I was here at the time. It was a really historic time for the Ukrainian people where they came of age as a nation. And for Putin, it was deja vu. It was East Berlin. It was East Germany again. It was 1989. It was the Velvet Revolution. It was Perestroika. It was all the things that he's terrified of, and that have haunted him all these years. He saw it happening again in Ukraine, and he understood that if Ukraine now is able to fully break free and become fully independent and democratic, then the chances are that Russia may go further into this breakup, the breakup that began in '89. You may get other regions like Chechnya tried to break away from Russia. So for Putin, it became Ukraine became the crux of his sort of foreign policy. He had to stop the democracy there. He had to stop the spread of democracy in Ukraine, the consolidation of democracy, and he had to get the country back into the Russian orbit. And these became the things that he genuinely became obsessed by this. There's a lot of people from an inner circle who talk about this, that he would literally talk about Ukraine all the time. And we see very clearly, he sacrificed his entire relationship with the Western world over Ukraine. He's built his foreign policy around Ukraine. To a significant degree, he's built even his domestic policy around Ukraine. So this is a crucial issue for him. And I think now, at this point in this obsession, now we're 20 years down from the Orange Revolution. We went through the invasion of 2014. We got to the full-scale invasion of 2022. Nothing that Putin had done had been able to succeed in pushing Ukraine away from this European choice, from this democratic choice. He basically seems to have decided around the time of COVID, we think, he seems to have basically decided, okay, that's it. I cannot allow Ukraine to continue to exist as an independent country. And he's basically now, his goal, as I tried to lay out in the essay you refer to, his goal is now essentially, it has to be, in his logic, it has to be the destruction of Ukraine as an independent country. So that doesn't mean the destruction and the death of every single person in Ukraine, although it will mean the death of many of them. It means the erasure, the removal of Ukraine as an independent country. So Ukraine now, as far as Putin is concerned, can only exist as a Russian satellite regime. It can only be part of Russia, essentially.
Ukraine is very populous. If you've got millions of people that don't want to be part of you, aren't you risking even a worse situation with a whole bunch of very disgruntled, upset, hateful people as part of your country that will lead to internal, disputes and problems?
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, that's what he's counting on. I mean, you would see again, we don't have to speculate here. We're already seeing this happening. We're seeing this happening in areas that he controls in Ukraine now. And what we're seeing is a very clear pattern. There's been mass arrests. So when the Russians take over an area, what they do is they arrest preemptively without any
But you can't arrest 40 million people.
He can't arrest 40 million, but he can arrest 1 million. And that's what he'll do. Will arrest So what they do, they'll imagine they come into a town, a small town of say 10,000 people. The Russians will have lists. They'll have local collaborators who will help them compile the lists, and they will then go into the town and they will arrest all of the elected local officials. They'll arrest them and interview them and see who's ready to collaborate and who's not ready to collaborate. If they're ready to collaborate, fine, they can go free. But the ones who aren't ready to collaborate or resist or suggest that they might not like it, those people go into the basements, so to call. Well, it basically means they get thrown into concentration camps, essentially, or prison networks. So that's the elected officials. Journalists, they go into the prisons. Volunteers, members of civil society, activists, they're arrested. Former military veterans, people who served in the army, they're all arrested. Family members of people who served in the army, they're arrested. So they'll go into a town, let's say approximately 10,000 people, and they won't arrest all 10,000, but they'll arrest maybe 200-300 people, and they'll arrest the leaders, the religious leaders as well, and they'll arrest those people. Some of them will say, no, I got no problem, we're ready to collaborate. And then they can begin collaboration, and that does happen. But the majority of those people will simply disappear. And we don't know where those people are. And that's happened systematically in every single place the Russians have taken over in southern and eastern Ukraine. So we're talking about, again, in total, it's probably tens of thousands of people. We don't have, it's very difficult to be specific about numbers because it's all under Russian occupation. We don't have access to these areas. But the United Nations published a report a few months ago that classified these mass arrests as a crime against humanity. They said this clearly qualifies as a crime against humanity based on what we know. And the more we know, frankly, the worse it gets. So they're already doing this. They've already shown they can do this, and they will do this. So they can expand that from 20% of Ukraine to 50% of Ukraine, and potentially to the whole of Ukraine. Of course, as you say, that will cause, create incredible instability and security risks, and frankly, almost unimaginable human rights abuses. But the Russians don't really worry about that so much. They don't really care. And frankly, if you look at it from their point of view, where's the backlash of what they've done so far? They've already done this. They've already done this to 20% of the population in Ukraine. That's the size of a medium-sized European country. And where is the backlash? There's no major international outcry. There's this UN report that I mentioned, but nothing has come of that. No one's, Russia still sits on the UN Security Council, despite the fact that the UN itself has said that they are committing crimes against humanity in Europe today. So from a Russian point of view, as horrific as it all sounds, what's to stop them? What's the backlash? Why should they stop? They can do it. They will do it. If they're not stopped, they will do this. I'm very confident in that.
A few minutes ago, you described how Putin, but lots of people in Russia think of the importance of Kyiv, the importance of Ukraine to Russia, and you described how it was the birthplace of the Russian people. If that's true, then is Putin right that Ukraine is Russian?
Well, the historic roots of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all go back to the Kiev roots per se. But of course, you can argue about that. We can say, if we wanted to apply that argument, then America is Britain, then Britain is France, arguably, then France is Rome, then Rome is Mesopotamia, perhaps Greece, and so on and so forth. Lots of countries have shared historic stories, have common roots, have shared ancestry. Ukraine has a distinct and national narrative, a historical narrative going back, arguably 1,000 years, certainly hundreds and hundreds of years, independent of Russia. The Ukraine was not an independent state until very recently. So that's part of the reason why the Russians are very insistent that Ukraine has always been part of Russia. But actually, most of Ukraine for hundreds of years was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Large parts of Ukraine were part of the Ottoman Empire for a long time. And then we go back even further. There were periods of Cossack sort of semi-statehood. And there were times when the Ukraine was part of the Mongol Empire and the Golden Horde. So it's a very, very complex story, but it's certainly not Ukraine was part of Russia and then it wasn't. The Russian part of Ukraine's history is significant, but it's by far not the only part of that story. And Ukraine's struggle to be free has always been part of European history. The great French thinker Voltaire, he was writing in the early 18th century, I think early-ish, 1830, sorry, 1730s, I think he was writing. He wrote a history of Eastern Europe and the Swedish King Charles XII, and he wrote in that book. So this is almost 300 years ago. He wrote the line, "Ukraine has always strived to be free." So even then, 300 years ago, Ukraine was a recognizable concept to someone like Voltaire living in France. And he was also familiar with the idea that Ukraine had always been struggling to establish itself as an independent state. So, the idea that Russia has some historic claims to Ukraine really doesn't hold up. But again, even if it did in some sort of academic sense, we can't live our lives like that. Although every single border in Europe will be under question again, because everyone has a claim to everybody else. As I say, if we start making these claims, then all of a sudden the Hungarians have got claims against all their neighbours. The Germans have got claims against half of Poland. The French have got claims against the Belgians, and the Spanish have got claims against the Portuguese, and so on and so forth. I mean, it will be a recipe for complete chaos, in international relations, and frankly, that's why nobody does this. Russia is the only person. Putin is the only person trying to promote these sort of, these extremely dangerous ideas about historical revisionism and revanchism.
This article that you wrote, I found very interesting because effectively what you were saying is Putin just doesn't want peace. And you actually went and bragged about the Fox News and Brit Hume actually giving you a stage, a podium to make a comment on in the United States, and that Fox News was supportive of your position. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want us, Peter, to really explore this. Has Trump got, has the West got any opportunity to make peace, given what he's described of Putin's almost maniacal desire to reverse what happened in 1989, 1992, etc. This long history that he wants to reverse of Ukraine being independent from Russia. Is there any chance, absolutely any chance for a peace? We're going to take a break and come back, and we're going to ask Peter to talk about that. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We got Peter Dickinson coming to us from Kyiv, Ukraine. He's the Ukraine alert editor for the Atlantic Council. He's written a really fascinating article. And Peter, your argument is, bottom line, Putin doesn't want peace. So what are we doing? Why are we actually trying to get him to the table? Like, should we just give up?
No, I don't think we can give up. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that at the moment, he doesn't want peace, i.e. the conditions at the moment he doesn't feel under any pressure to go for peace. So on the one hand, I think it's crucial to recognize that his goals are much broader and more ambitious than the kind of peace that's on the table now. He's looking to end what he regards as the sort of anomaly or the threat posed by an independent Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to be brought to heel, to be brought back into Russia, to become a Russian vassal state in one form or another. So that's his goal. Does he want peace? No, I don't think so. And we can see by his actions, I think that's quite clear. But that doesn't mean he can't be coerced into seeking peace. I mean, Russia is not a superpower. Russia is not all powerful. Russia, compared to the collective strength of the West, cannot compete realistically. So really, we need to look at why is it that the West is not doing enough to coerce and to force Putin into ending this war? Why are we looking to offer him concessions and to sort of somehow persuade him that it's in his interest to end the war and offer him various different incentives to do so? Realistically, I think this is a mistake. This is the wrong approach. The West needs to speak to Putin in the only language he understands, which is the language of strength, and demonstrate that if he does not end this war, the costs for Russia will be extremely severe in terms of Russia's future viability as a state. The West will pressure Russia in ways that could threaten Russia's future existence. Now, the West is very reluctant to do that. Now, why are they reluctant to do that? Why is it that the West has been, in my opinion, quite maybe not half-hearted, but very limited in the support it's given to Ukraine. Now, I think there's two aspects to this issue. One is they're afraid of Russia striking back against them. They're afraid of Russia escalating the war geographically. So they're afraid that Russia will bring the war to Europe, will bring the war to North America, maybe would use nuclear weapons, as Putin has often threatened to do. So that's one aspect of it. They're afraid of escalation. The other aspect, which I think doesn't get enough attention, is they're also afraid of Russia breaking up. They're afraid of what it would mean if Russia were to break up as a state and were to collapse. And then all of a sudden we'd have perhaps 5 or 10 new countries emerging on the former territory of Russia, some of which would possess thousands of nuclear warheads and many other weapons besides. And that's that fear of Russian collapse, some people believe, is even stronger than fear of Russian escalation. But the two factors, both of them, have sort of encouraged the West to be quite timid in their support for Ukraine. To give Ukraine enough weapons to survive, but not enough weapons to win, and to place restrictions on Ukraine, for example, saying, okay, we'll give you weapons, but you can't use them inside Russia. You can't attack Russia. You can't you can't strike targets inside Russia, for example. So, in that environment where the West is being very limited in the support it provides for Ukraine, Putin is essentially looking at the situation now and saying, well, I can continue. This is not a problem for me. Yeah, I'm losing a lot of men. It's costing me a lot of money, but I'm happy to let that. I'm happy to pay that price. I'm going to continue the war. So I think really, if we want to stop the war, we've got to change that thinking, that approach.
Do you have a sense of what's happening in Russia? We hear that there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of deaths. That the economy is devastated, but at the same time they're sort of bringing Stalin back to life, and the Putin has complete support. What's going on in Russia? Is there any opposition to the war, or is it 100% support of Putin?
Well, it is notoriously difficult to get a realistic sense of what the levels of support are in Russia for the war, for example, or for Putin per se. That's notoriously challenging to try and do. I think, of course, he's basically removed all opposition, and Putin has created a scenario in Russia where most people would agree, I think, that there's really only two options. They either have Putin in charge or they have chaos. Now, they all remember chaos from the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell, and Putin's manipulated that very well to say, basically, it's me, and I bring stability, but it's a hard line, but I'll give you stability. Or it's the chaos in the 1990s when everyone was terribly poor, criminality went through the roof, people lived basically like, it was a third world country, essentially, by living standards, and complete destitution. So, in that environment, a lot of people will say, yeah, better Putin, even if they don't particularly like what he's doing, and they maybe even actively dislike what he's doing. They'll support him because they're terrified of the idea of returning to chaos. So that's been a very powerful factor that he's got. And then, of course, the other factor here is that he's killed or removed anyone who could be an opponent of his. So there's no alternatives. So I think he legitimately does have quite high levels of support, but I think it's important to qualify that. It's not passionate ideological support. It's people who, by and large, are saying, yeah, better him because the alternatives are so desperate. We just rather have this guy. In terms of support for the war, I think that it's not massively popular. I don't think people are really very jingoistic about it. I think a lot of people are indifferent to it. Putin's main strategy has been to keep it distant from people, to prevent people from being disrupted by the war. So we had one big mobilization drive to conscript people into the army in September 2022, and that was massively unpopular. Around 1 million Russians fled the country, military-aged men fled the country, and it created enormous amounts of negative feeling in Russia about the forced participation in this war. So what Putin's been very careful to do is to isolate people from the war, to protect them, to sort of shield them from the war. Now, he's done that by recruiting, first and foremost, by recruiting in the army from the sort of fringes of society. So the people going into the army now, the vast majority of the army are volunteers, and they're being paid huge money to go. So they're going for money, basically. They're not going out of ideology or patriotism or sort of martial valor. They're going for money. They're being paid. They're basically a mercenary army, and they're being paid very, very well by Russian standards. I mean, they're being paid signing on fees for tens of thousands of dollars in a country where the average salary is around $500, $600, $700 a month. So it's huge. It's life-changing money for them. And once they're there in Ukraine, they're being paid huge salaries, 5 or 6 times what they would expect to be paid back home. And if they're injured or killed, they get huge compensation payments as well. So this is really, it's actually been, these payments are so big. If we were to translate them into most Western economies, perhaps a Canadian or American or British economy, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars signing on fees. It would be tens of thousands of dollars salaries. That would be the equivalent. So a lot of people are ready to go. So they're volunteers, and they're dying in huge numbers, but they're volunteers. They chose to go. So there's not a huge amount of social, mobilization against that, of opposition. People are kind of, they're accepting of it because these people knew the risks. They chose to go.
So, I understand that, one of the problems with Afghanistan was that it was like the mothers that were complaining. You don't have any of that right now in Russia.
No, because in Afghanistan, they were conscripts. They were forced to go and fight. Here, they're volunteering. So that's the key difference. These people are not being forced to fight. No one's making them do it. They're choosing to go. They're volunteering. They're literally personally going out and saying, I'm signing up for this because I want that money. I want the money. And that's why
Peter,
they do it.
I've got to ask you then, if he doesn't have opposition, if Putin doesn't have opposition within Russia, or at least opposition that can actively mobilize, that the people are volunteering because they want all this cash. The economy, while struggling, isn't devastated. And you've described well this Putin maniacal desire to take over Ukraine. He couldn't, and you went farther. You didn't say his career. You didn't say his job. You called it his reign at the beginning of the show. So if Putin has a reign, and he wants to save sort of the great Russia that he dreamt of from his youth, how could he ever give back 20% of Ukraine that he is currently occupied? How could he ever do that? How could he ever allow the borders to be removed back to the original borders?
Well, the only way, you're quite right, it's a huge challenge. The only way is if he fears the alternative is even worse. He has to be made to fear that Russia itself could cease to exist as a nation if he does not end this war. That's the only way he'll do it, in my opinion. It has to be brought home to him that Russia itself could break up as a nation if he does not end the war, that the West is prepared to provide Ukraine with the tools to attack Russia inside Russia, on a significant scale to dismantle Russia's energy industry, for example, its military industrial complex and so forth, in ways that will create strains inside Russia. There's a lot of people. Russia is a lot more fragile, I think, than a lot of people appreciate outside, because they see this huge approval rating of Putin. They assume he's very, very, he has an incredibly strong grip on the country. But if we cast our minds back just 2 years to 2023, when we had the very brief but very, very shocking mutiny of the Wagner soldiers. This was the mercenary army that Putin had built up over the last decade, and then that turned against him in 2023 and marched on Moscow briefly. Now that mutiny was over in a couple of days. It was a kind of blink and you missed it moment. But when that happened, those troops, there was not that many, around 20,000 of them, I believe. They were able to seize one of Russia's biggest cities, Rostov in the south, and march on Moscow almost unopposed. No one opposed them. No one rallied to Putin. No one said, we're going to save the Tsar. They basically tried to flee. People were running. They were trying to get away. Putin was silent at first, for the first day. It wasn't the actions of a strong leader who has the support and the confidence of his nation. So I think that Putin is aware that his position in Russia is vulnerable. If the West is prepared to challenge that, and make him think that he could actually face a very serious threat to his own reign in Russia, it won't be that difficult for him actually to make the decision to say, okay, enough of this. I'm going to end this war because I've got to consolidate my grip on Russia itself. We've seen the vulnerabilities we've seen, again, the Wagner mutiny. What we don't see is the West will to do that. Now, that needs to change. Will that happen or not? I don't know. As I mentioned earlier, the West is afraid of Russia breaking up and the consequences for global security. So they may well be too reluctant to go down that road. But that is the way to do it. That's how you stop Putin, by showing him that he is actually risking not only not achieving his goals in Ukraine, but undermining his actual fundamental position in Russia itself.
What are you talking about? Are you talking about active NATO involvement or active U.S. involvement? If you had a chance to actually speak to President Donald Trump, what would you tell him he needs to do?
I think that direct involvement of NATO or the European countries is unrealistic. As much as I would favour that and would think that would have been the smart thing to do. I think the only type of direct involvement that perhaps is realistic would be some sort of an air coverage, air shield, an air patrolling regime over Ukrainian airspace to shoot down Russian missiles and rockets in exactly the same manner that the Western countries do for Israel in terms of when it's attacked by Iran. We've seen this just in recent months. We've seen how Britain and France and America and other Western nations provide Israel with air support to protect its airspace. And it's very feasible. It's very possible to do that. They do it, and it didn't bring, didn't escalate into any sort of war with Iran. Now, they've been reluctant to do that with Russia. If they did do that over Ukraine, I think that would be a very effective form of support. But it wouldn't win the war, but it would be helpful. But I think if you want to talk about how to end the war on maybe even not even talking about winning the war, but ending the war on a realistic and sustainable sort of long-term note, the West needs to provide Ukraine with a lot more firepower in terms of long-range strike capabilities. Ukraine needs to be able to strike deep inside Russia with ballistic missiles, with cruise missiles, and the West can provide them either directly by donating them to Ukraine or by helping Ukraine's ability to manufacture them here in Ukraine. That would be absolute key. The West needs to provide a lot of other weaponry as well. It doesn't need to provide troops. Ukraine has the troops, and they're among the best troops in the world, actually, I should add as well. And they're ready to fight. Although the country's exhausted, but still they're ready. They still have the capabilities to fight on. But what they don't have is the ability to bring the war to Russia. That would be, that would be a way of striking at Putin's base. And we saw just recently, to give you an indication of how this might look, how this might work. In recent months, Ukraine has made a concerted effort to disrupt Russia's civilian air travel industry. So to basically shut down the airports. Now, they're not bombing airports, they're not bombing airplanes, they're not killing civilians, but they are putting drones into the airspace around airports, which forces the airports by international law to close their airspace and to cancel flights. So that in effect, of course, it's July, so it's August now, so this is over June and July. This is the summer season. Ukraine's doing that for a reason. They're doing that because they want to bring the war home to ordinary Russians. All the ordinary Russians wanted to go on summer holidays, and they went to the airport with their suitcases to go on a nice summer holiday, and they were told, you can't go anywhere this year, you can't fly anywhere, your flight's being cancelled because Ukraine has put the drones in the air. And so this was a way of bringing the war home to ordinary Russians and making them say, I don't like this, I don't approve of this, I'm not happy about this, in a sense. And the Russians reacted. There was a lot of very interesting comments from Russian propagandists saying this is very dangerous. Russia dismissed its transport minister because he was disgraced because he wasn't able to stop this and prevent this from happening. It was not perhaps a major development, but it was significant, I think, because it shows that Ukraine understands that one of their key goals that Ukraine has to do to change Putin's thinking is to make the Russians fed up with this war. And they don't want to do that by killing people as Russians. I mean, Russians are killing Ukrainian civilians every day. The Ukrainians don't want to do that. And by and large, they haven't done that. But there are ways of doing it other ways, attacks on economic targets, attacks on, again, the airport thing that we've seen recently, attacks on logistics, making life more difficult for the Russian day to day is one way of making people fed up with it and then perhaps stirring up the Russian people a little bit, who are going to say, you know what, we're fed up with this now. We've got to get beyond this.
Peter, we've heard stories about protests in Ukraine. We've heard about not many people left to join the army. That a lot of people have left the country. That some men are in hiding because they don't want to have to join the army. Does Ukraine still have public support? Does the leadership of Ukraine, the army of Ukraine, the fight against Russia have public support?
Yeah, the fight against Russia has overwhelming public support. I wouldn't even. I don't even know if support is the right word. Ukrainians understand that this is an existential fight. They basically have two choices. They can either fight and defend their country, or their country doesn't exist. That's it. It's not a matter of do we like this political leader or that political leader. Do they like Zelensky? No, a lot of people don't like him. Do they like the political leadership? A lot of people hate them. Do they think that they should surrender to Russia? Almost nobody. Almost nobody says we should end the war and surrender. So the big mistake I think that Putin has made, or perhaps not a mistake, or the big problem he has, is that he's creating an environment where Ukrainians really have very little choice. Now, there are a lot of people who are hiding, or who don't want to fight, or avoiding service in the military. There's still, there's a huge number of people who are serving in the military, and there's a lot of problems with conscription, with mobilization, with finding the soldiers to man the front lines, and it gets more difficult all the time to fill in the gaps, because Ukraine is also suffering heavy casualties. But having said all that, fundamentally, there's really not much of a choice for Ukrainians. They don't see it as a political battle or something. They see it as a fight for survival. They can either fight or they can not fight. And so there'll be, there's a lot of negativity about the politicians here. There's no reverence for their political classes in Ukraine. There's no deference. They're very critical of the Ukrainian politics, of all of them, and including Zelensky and all the people around him. But fundamentally, they're not fighting for them. They're not fighting. They're fighting for themselves. They're fighting for their homes and their families. And that is a extremely powerful motivating factor. So, despite all of the hardships and all the limitations, I don't see the critical mass breaking there. I think there's too much at stake for them.
It seems like what you said is that Putin's got no choice, because this is what he's always sort of dreamt of, and this is how he's defined his reign. And the Ukrainian people have no choice. So, Trump said that he was going to end the war in 24 hours, and then he's given deadline after deadline after deadline. You say that Putin doesn't want peace. Peter, what's going to happen? What do you really honestly believe is going to happen?
Well, the key factor here is the extent to which the West provides support. That's the absolute key factor. If the West provides no support, Ukraine may gradually lose the war and be overtaken, and then Ukraine will cease to exist. It won't happen tomorrow, but it might happen within a 1 to 2 year or maybe 5 year time frame. Eventually, Ukraine will, the Russian gains would reach a critical mass, and the front lines could break, and the country would be overrun, and then very quickly we would see the largest crimes against humanity that Europe has seen since Nazi Germany. You would see a country being extinguished live on Instagram, as it were. Again, we're already seeing that to a degree in East and South Ukraine, but you would see that on a national scale. You would see tens of millions of people flooding into the EU, the largest migration crisis again since World War II, and so on. That could happen. That's the worst case scenario, if the West provides no support. If the West continues to provide a certain degree of support, as it's doing now, this might stretch on for many, many years, and we'll see small changes in the front lines, and we'll see atrocities against Ukrainian civilians, and we might see Ukraine becoming stronger in its ability to strike inside Russia, but no major changes. I think that would suit Putin to a degree, just a continuation of where we are now. That would be actually quite agreeable to Putin. He'd much rather end the war, I think it's victoriously, but if he can keep it going where it is now, that would be pretty much, that would suit him, suit his interests in Ukraine and domestically in Russia and also internationally. If the West steps up and increases the support it provides for Ukraine and gives Ukraine greater firepower, then we could see the war turning back in Ukraine's favor, because Ukraine will then be able to bring the war back to Russia more. We'll be able to disrupt Russia on the domestic front to make it a much more balanced campaign where Russia is no longer a safe haven, which could put a lot more pressure on Putin and change his calculus, change the calculus of people around him, change the thinking of those who can influence him in Russia, the very few within his inner circle who have some sort of influence, some economic influence perhaps, or political influence, and then force the Russians to rethink where they're going and what it might mean for Russia itself. So it really depends. I think you're quite right. Putin is fully committed to continuing the war. Ukraine is fully committed to defending itself. Neither of those factors are going to change. The X factor is the role of the West in this. What's the West prepared to do, and what's the West not prepared to do? So that's really where we need to look. That's where we're going to see the big developments. And Trump has a huge role to play in that. And his messaging varies. It goes up and down. At the beginning of the war, at the beginning of his term, he was saying like pretty crazy pro-Kremlin stuff. He was blaming Ukraine for the war. He was accusing Ukraine of he was calling Zelensky a dictator. We all remember the big argument in the Oval Office. And now his messaging is very different. He's very critical of Russia. He talks about getting tough with the Russians. He talks about how Putin is to blame and Putin doesn't want peace and so on. And now I think probably the most important development we've seen in recent months has been Trump's agreement. Not these deadlines that he gives, these ultimatums. They never lead anywhere. 2 weeks, 50 days, 10 days. None of it ever goes anywhere. But the one thing we have seen that is, I think, very significant is Trump saying, I'm going to sell weapons to Ukraine and Europe is going to buy them. That is a key thing, because now that opens up a lot of opportunities to increase the flow of weapons to Ukraine for the long term, potentially. So that's one of the, we're talking about Europe, Western sports, the X factor. That's one of the things I'm really keeping an eye on now. What sort of weapons are being bought by the Europeans? How much the Europeans are prepared to buy? How much the Americans are prepared to sell? Because that could be a really significant aspect of this whole big picture.
Peter Dickinson, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your writing, your updates, and coming on our show. Appreciate it. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'll remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. You get all my webcasts and podcasts on my website, briancrombie.ca. Good night, everybody.